and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. For this episode, we have organized a discussion on trade policy and industrial policy, where we hope to unpack the recent news around potential tariffs being announced by the Trump White House, as well as a general conversation on India's trade with both US and China. Joining us to discuss this topic is Mr. Peter Harrell. Peter is a non resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He also serves as an attorney advising companies and investors on international legal, regulatory, and geopolitical risks. As a member of Carnegie's American Statecraft program, his research focuses on issues of U.S. domestic economic competitiveness, trade policy, and the use of economic tools in U.S. foreign policy. From January 2021 through 2022, Peter served as a U.S. White House at the U.S. White House as a senior director for international economics, jointly appointed to the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. Immediately prior to joining the White House, Peter had served on the Biden-Harris transition team from September 2020 to January 2021. Mr. Harrell, welcome to Interpreting India.
That's terrific to join you. Thanks for having me on.
So with that, I think we can probably move on to the first question, which again is about tariffs and trade. So that's great. Earlier in 2024, President Trump had announced that he will likely impose a 20% tariff on all imports and a 60% tariff on Chinese imports. A new addition to this statement has been tariffs attempted on all goods from countries like Mexico. Is the perceived status of Mexico as a destination to reroute Chinese goods the reason for this attempt? And what could be done differently by Mexico to alter this perception? This may be important for India as it increasingly finds itself as the destination for Chinese electronic goods intermediate components, despite not having a favorable trade arrangement with either China like the RCEP or with the US like the USMCA. So over to you, Peter.
Well, as I said, thanks very much for having me on. And I think one of the things we are seeing across the board out of the Trump administration is that President Trump in his second term is even more committed to the aggressive use of tariffs than he was during his first term. He certainly deployed a number of tariffs during his first term, particularly against China and particularly against a couple of products like steel and aluminum. She's recently re-tariffed again. But what we are seeing in term two is that, as you said, he campaigned on a very aggressive set of tariff promises, and he is moving in his first couple of weeks in office to begin implementing a number of these tariff promises. So we've seen him threaten an across-the-board tariff on Canada and Mexico of 25%. That then got paused for a month while he negotiates with the Canadians and Mexicans. We've seen him bring back steel and aluminum tariffs just earlier this week. And then we see him talking about, and it's interesting to see how some of his thinking has evolved. We see him talking about either imposing this universal tariff on all imports, or something he's talked about more recently, just in the last week or so. Maybe instead of having a universal tariff, the U.S. would move towards a reciprocal tariff system where our tariff rates would basically match the rate applied by our trading partners. A reciprocal tariff rate could actually have particularly significant impacts on a country like India, which has substantially higher tariffs than the United States does. If you took him at his word on this reciprocal tariff system, you might actually see a somewhat modest increase in tariffs on a jurisdiction like the United Kingdom, which already has pretty low tariffs. But you'd actually see a substantial increase in U.S. tariffs on India. I'm sure this is a topic of discussion as we are recording this. It's the morning here in the United States, so the day that Prime Minister Modi is going to be meeting with President Trump. I am sure this is going to be a very substantial topic of discussion for the two leaders here in Washington. Washington today. Final point I want to make, and I think this is very relevant on how he thinks about universal tariffs and what it could mean for a country like India. Trump has articulated sort of three different goals for tariffs. So he's talked about tariffs one goal being kind of raising revenue, sort of American tax revenue. And historically, if you go back 100, 150 years, the U.S. did quite a bit of that. We've not done quite a bit of that in the last century. But he does see tariffs as raising revenue. That's one thing he talks about. Then he talks about tariffs as kind of rebuilding manufacturing. I think that's kind of his goal of these very recent steel and aluminum tariffs, to help make more steel and aluminum here in the U.S. by fending off foreign competition. And then he talks about tariffs as kind of leverage for negotiations. He wants something out of India on the trade front, more market access for American firms, or he wants something out of Mexico. He wants Mexico to crack down on fentanyl, or he wants Mexico to crack down on its ties to China, and tariffs is that kind of leverage that he has over them. And I think what's going to be complicated for a country like India is that, the extent to which Trump wants tariffs for revenue or to protect American manufacturing, it's kind of hard for a foreign country to do much to avoid those tariffs, right? Because he's not actually asking the foreign country to do anything. He's simply saying, I want the tax revenue, or I want to protect my industry. To the extent that he is using them as leverage, then there's obviously a deal to be had, at least in concept. And so what I think you're seeing countries doing, whether it's Mexico and Canada have been the brunt of this over the last couple of weeks, or I think as we get into more global tariffs, what you're going to see countries do is kind of try to channel this U.S. tariff energy towards negotiations and towards maybe there is a deal to be had, rather than having Trump just see this as revenue, in which case the tariffs are largely unavoidable.
Thanks, Peter. This brings me to my next question, and it's going to just basically pick up on your answer. But it also speaks to the point that we've recently seen countries like China, which have really been subsidizing their exports. India would probably, I don't think, have the same kind of financial wherewithal to sort of subsidize exports to the same extent. Yes, it is true that Indian average weighted tariff rates on American goods is pretty high, with recent press reports pegging it at around 9.5%, whereas American tariffs on Indian imports are around 3%. But would it be fair to treat every country with the same broad stroke? Because honestly speaking, every country does not have the same financial, backing and the same subsidy package to sort of push their exports. So how's the Trump White House, or how should they be looking at this topic?
Yeah, so I think another great question, Konark, and I think that I should begin this my answer here by saying, as you said at the top, I served in the Biden administration, which had a somewhat different view of tariffs than the Trump administration does. I mean, the Biden administration, President Biden, used tariffs in a kind of selective and targeted way, particularly to try to put pressure on China, both over its subsidies and over its national security risks. And the Biden administration obviously wanted to take a kind of diplomatic approach to trying to align a number of allies and partners, including, very importantly, India. I mean, you look at the work the Biden White House did with India to deepen that strategic relationship and that economic relationship, with the kind of strategic concept that we needed an economic alliance against China to collectively reduce our dependence on China. I think when it gets to Trump, and if I'm looking at this from an Indian perspective, because I sort of agree, I mean, India is not going to be able, nor should it, try to subsidize its industries the way China subsidizes its industries. I think there is an argument that the Indian government, the Prime Minister Modi, can make to Trump of look, the problem we all face in our trade balances is Chinese overcapacity. It's flooding your market, your American market. It's flooding our Indian market. It's flooding markets in Europe. And instead of you, President Trump, tariffing us here in India, let's jointly erect some common tariffs against China to try to create a market where we can compete with each other, and where, stuff that just isn't going to be made in the U.S. much anymore can be made in India, and where companies that are trying to get out of China can use India as a manufacturing base. Let's work on this China problem collectively, and that's a better way to channel these tariffs than you, Donald Trump, actually tariffing us here in India. It's better for the economy. It's better for the geopolitics. I think pretty much anyone who is an economist who looks at this would agree that that's a better economic approach. I also think most of us who think about geopolitics would agree that's a better geopolitical approach, because we want to deepen this strategic alliance between the U.S. and India, as well as deepening the economic ties. I also would note, when I look at India, fastest growing large economy in the world, huge market opportunity for American firms over there. Like, there's a lot to be said for American firms by getting to a more open market in India and a deeper trade and investment ties between the two countries. This all makes sense. The challenge is somebody's got to sell this to Donald Trump to get him out of his mindset of, I just want to tariff everybody. So those are the arguments I would make. And we just got to hope that they prove successful in getting through to our president.
That's a great point, and that segues into something I want to bring up, because India did sort of pursue something similar last year. So India in March 2024 came out with this electric vehicle policy, the first of its kind, where essentially, as per press reports, this was done after informal consultation with Elon Musk and Tesla. So the policy was more about how, if any investor in the EV segment invests more than $500 million and does so for a period of about 5 years, basically selling cars which are priced above a certain threshold, then India would bring down the import duties on those cars from 100% to 15%, 1-5. That was a massive sort of incentive for Tesla to come through. There was talks, even after the policy was announced, that this will finally be what India needs to get Tesla to come to India and set up a gigafactory. However, it didn't happen. India sort of held back BYD, SAIC from coming into India. But at the same time, what was supposed to be a fairly attractive incentive by Indian standards was not taken up by Tesla. So here, India is sort of, proactively pushing back against Chinese automakers coming into India and incentivizing Tesla to come into India, but it didn't happen. Is there a chance, you would say, and I know it's hard to sort of give it a very clear answer on this, but would it be possible to revive this discussion on EV policies with the likes of Tesla, and would this be perhaps the incentive which the Trump White House might see as being attractive enough?
That's an interesting question. Of course, there's a political challenge in the United States on this, because whereas the Biden administration was strongly supportive of EV policy, the Trump administration, despite the fact that Elon Musk has an office in the White House these days, the Trump administration remains skeptical of EVs. Now, that said, we did see some evolution in Trump's thinking over the course of the campaign about EVs and in the early days of his administration, which I think reflects in part his relationship with Mr. Musk. We've seen Trump kind of shift from what I would characterize to an anti-EV stance to more of a I'm not pro or against any kind of car. They all need to succeed on the merit. So I don't want to subsidize EVs just the way we don't subsidize gasoline cars, but, we'll let them compete on the market. And Elon Musk obviously remains very, very committed both to EVs as a commercial venture, and also because I think Mr. Musk believes, for the future of the climate and the planet, it is sort of policy-wise important to transition to EVs and have a green transition. So I think the question here is really going to be, from where I sit, the policy opportunity is very high to make another run at this. And I think India, the world's biggest, most populous country, a rapid economic growth, you're going to have huge EV demand. If I were Elon, I would very much want to revisit this, because I would want to be in India, manufacturing in India, both for that market and for sort of other emerging markets around the, sort of in the South Central Asia region. But I think that the challenge is going to be just on the U.S. political side. Is kind of now the time to broach this issue with President Trump, or do you let him settle in a little bit more and come back to the EV issue?
That's great, and that's a point well taken. Now, moving on to the next point, you did speak about how we sort of should be looking at Chinese overcapacity, and now nowhere in India, at least, this is more evident in terms of the imports coming in from China in the last couple of years. Large number of chips, electronic components have been coming in. Now, in light of this, there's been a recent, USTR announcement by the Biden White House in December, where they sort of, sought to undertake an investigation of China's manufacturing of foundational semiconductors, including the extent to which they're incorporated into components into downstream industries as well. Now, considering how India has, increasingly been seeing these chips being imported, and they're likely being assembled into products being assembled here in certain, clusters in India, how might the investigation by the USTR, coupled with the fact that there was news a while back in the FT about the Trump White House imposing component tariffs, which would be imposed on the entire product, how might that be seen, in the Indian circles, or at least, could Indian exports, which are seen as incorporating such components, be subject to higher tariffs?
I think that the semiconductor issue over the mid to long term, I'll come back to sort of the short term, but over a sort of 2 to 4 year, 3 to 5 year period, actually has substantial upside for India. I think India can be a major winner off this fight. So what is this issue that we're facing? So, a couple of years ago, the U.S. and Western Europe, some European countries, Japan, South Korea, began to realize that we were overly dependent on high-end semiconductors being made in Taiwan, and that there wasn't enough geographic diversity in high-end semiconductors. And then we also realized we did not want China to be able to make high-end semiconductors. So you saw some policy support to try to make more high-end semiconductors in the US and in Western Europe and Korea in particular. And you also saw some policy measures to try to cut off China's ability to make high-end semiconductors, the kind of things that are training AI and, high-end semiconductors. How did China respond? China actually did a very logical thing here. What they said is, if all these export controls apply to high-end semiconductors, we're going to focus on building lower-end semiconductors, which are still really important. These are the kinds of things that go into, the microphones we're both using, that go into cars, that go into, airplanes. A lot of the sort of stuff you go into medical devices, stuff you use day to day, is not really the highest end semiconductors. It's more of these, middle range semiconductors. So China has been heavily investing to try to capture global market share in these kind of what they're called mature node or legacy semiconductors. Now, this creates a problem. It creates, one, a potential economic problem, because firms outside of China that make these semiconductors are seeing economic disadvantage. And second, it creates a potential national security problem if we all become very dependent on China for these chips that, you need to drive your car, that you need for your microwave to turn on. You create a national security problem. So what you're beginning to see is the United States look at policies, including this investigation, on how do we disincentivize Chinese mature node or old, legacy chips in the supply chain. And one way you can do that I think the Trump administration is thinking about, is you could have a tariff that would be based on where the semiconductor in this thing comes from. So if you have a device that's assembled in India, Chinese semiconductor in it, you get an extra $1 or $2 tariff. And that creates an incentive for the manufacturer to buy not Chinese semiconductors. So to buy the semiconductors from Korea or from Japan, or I think ultimately this creates an opportunity for India to make more of these legacy semiconductors. So in the short term, there could be some disruptions depending on how Trump sort of structures it, and do tariffs come into place right away, or do they have a ramp up time? But I actually think in the long run, what you're going to see is a policy that continues to have a country like India as a major manufacturing hub, but where it is buying these legacy semiconductors not from China, but from other countries, or beginning to produce them more domestically within India.
Thanks, Peter. Just moving on from that point itself, and like kind of staying on topic on the Chinese overcapacity and also on a surge in Chinese imports into India. India has abstained, as we all know, from joining the RCEP trade bloc. Yet, the surge of Chinese imports continues to grow in India at a very high pace, especially in the electronic goods sector as well. So I would just go back to your piece in the Foreign Affairs essay, which spoke about, how countries should come together and address this. Now, you did talk about how, India and both the US should be putting tariffs on Chinese goods. But can you paint the picture when it comes to the coalition of like-minded countries? How might they respond in kind towards the threat of Chinese imports? And India is one of them. So I think there will be some key takeaways here for India as well.
Yeah, and first let me say the economics of Chinese overcapacity really call for a collective response. And here's what I mean by that. So we see tremendous Chinese overcapacity, whether it is in kind of base materials like steel and aluminum, whether it is in a number of manufactured goods like vehicles, not just EVs, internal combustion engine vehicles as well. We're beginning to see it in mature node semiconductors. And the reason you need a collective response to this is that if from a global economic perspective, is that if the U.S. just unilaterally put up tariffs, or if India just unilaterally put up tariffs, what that really does is it just takes that Chinese overcapacity and pushes it into other markets. So I think you've sort of seen this with Chinese vehicles, where the U.S. has increased tariffs. The Chinese then couldn't really sell them into the U.S., so they began exporting many more to Europe. And now Europe is really facing the brunt of Chinese kind of mid and upper range vehicle overcapacity, because they don't come to the U.S. They're going over there. Now Europe's having to take steps to put up tariffs so it doesn't get, really decimated by this. So the economics, because of this displacement, really encourage a collective response. And so do the kind of politics and diplomacy, because from the Chinese perspective, if the U.S. is raising barriers, but they can just go sell to Europe and India and everywhere else, they actually don't have an incentive to reduce the overcapacity. They just have an incentive to find another market. Whereas if you raise the collective, if you raise tariffs collectively, the Chinese can't really find an alternative market. And so they actually then have to kind of come to the negotiating table and say, let's do something about this. And so I think there is a real opportunity. And I think that some of Trump's officials, like the person who is not yet in the seat at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, Jameson Greer, but who will be confirmed shortly to be U.S. Trade Representative, and I've met and talked with over the years, I think he understands the value of developing a kind of collective tariff response to Chinese overcapacity. I also think that the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, also sees the value to that and has talked about it. So what I am hopeful will happen is that as these people kind of settle in, get through their confirmation process, we call it here in the United States, that we will then see these officials around Trump begin to channel, begin to do the diplomatic blocking and tackling, come to India, go to Brussels, go to Seoul and South Korea, and actually begin to pull together an architecture of here's what we could all collectively do to raise these common tariffs on China. But for that diplomacy to happen, in fairness to the Trump administration's first couple of weeks, for that diplomacy to happen, you do need the people in their seats to go out and actually do it.
I mean, just thinking out loud here, Peter, could India's, coordination with the US or EU on tariffs and Chinese overcapacity be a bargaining chip of sorts for India to sort of plead or sort of convince the Trump White House not to hike tariff on Indian goods if India were to coordinate with the US on tariff on Chinese goods? But again, the US might say that this is in India's own interest to coordinate with us on Chinese overcapacity. But do you see this as like a bargaining chip if India were to sort of say, okay, we will coordinate our tariffs on Chinese overcapacity to sort of make sure that these EVs from China, or as the case might be, don't find a market in India? Could that be a possible bargaining chip?
So I think it is a bargaining chip that India should put on the table. I think the Trump administration will be evaluating whether, how valuable that chip is, because they'll also be saying, well, this is also in your own interest, like it's in both of our interests. So, that India may try to value this bargaining chip at, several $1,000s. Trump may come back and say, it's worth, $500. And, they'll sort of have that discussion. But I very much think it is a bargaining chip that India should put on the table.
Okay. So, I think this is no secret that India has been perceived as one of the more protectionist economies under the Trump administration. Even Robert Lighthizer book has a chapter on India as well, where he speaks about the Indian economy being fairly protectionist, one of the more protectionist ones out there. Now, this was also a point you alluded to as well in your foreign affairs essay, Peter. And just last week, the Indian government sort of released, not released, but I would say amended its tariff policy with regard to a number of goods, electronic goods, textile goods, and essentially, this has been seen to, attract firms which would want to diversify away from China. But how might this gradual, if I can use the word gradual or incremental lessening of tariffs on electronic goods be seen in trade policy circles in the U.S.?
So let me begin by saying I think the fact that India is, compared to global benchmarks, a relatively protectionist country is both a substantial risk when dealing with the Trump administration, but it also in an interesting way creates an opportunity. It is a risk because, if Trump pushes aggressively on this reciprocal tariff issue, rather than trying to build coalitions against China, obviously you see a risk of American average tariff rates on Indian goods going up substantially. Here's why I think it is an opportunity, though, because I think that if you're in the mind of a trade negotiator, an American trade negotiator, and you're thinking about economic interests, there isn't actually that much economic interest to be gained from a deal with a country like the United Kingdom. Just in the sense the UK already has a very open market. Maybe you reduce tariffs from 2% to 0%, but it's a pretty open market. So just from a US economic perspective, there's not that much to be gained. Whereas if you're a trade negotiator and you're looking at India, both as a pretty protected market right now, and also as the country that is going to generate a large share of global growth over the next 10 years as it continues to advance, that's a very attractive market to get access to. And so I think from the opportunity for India, if India is willing to liberalize to some degree with the United States, is to say, now's the time for this deal. Let's actually get a deal with respect to the United States. Because I think from the U.S. perspective, whereas a deal with the UK would mostly be about making nice with the UK, if there was a possibility for a deal with India that had some liberalization on India, you'd see a bunch of economic interests in America line up behind that to say, let's make that happen. So I think it really is an opportunity too, with the ball kind of being in India's court of, is India going to be, kind of a willing partner for a liberalizing deal or not? And if the answer is no, then I think there are risks if Trump does move down this kind of reciprocal tariff road that he's been talking about over the last couple of weeks.
So that's a great point. I think earlier on in the podcast, you spoke about how this could be a leveraging, Trump sees it as a way to raise revenue, to rebuild American manufacturing, and also as a way for leverage as well. There was just a piece today, I think Milind Vaishnav in the DC office had this interview where he spoke about how it might be time for now India under the Trump 2.0 White House to display strategic altruism. So I think now sort of the Biden White House had done a lot to sort of build this partnership with India on tech. I think the expectation now is that India would probably sort of, be a bit more flexible when it comes to negotiating on trade as well. Do you see that, given your experience Do you see that as happening in India? Do you see India being, willing to accommodate U.S. interests?
And that's long been a tough relationship. I think we have to be realistic and honest about that. It's long been a tough relationship. As you know, Konark, much better than I do, India has a very long history as a sort of proudly non-aligned country. And I think that we do have to understand, from an American perspective, we have to understand India's, politics and history that will shape India's view here. And so I think that, getting to deal making from the Indian side, I'm sure will face some challenges within the Indian Indian system. That said, when I look at the course of the last, not just the Biden administration, but going back to the Trump administration, I think you have seen this really transformative warming in the U.S. India relationship. Prime Minister Modi and Trump had a very good relationship during term one. They actually talked about a couple of economic issues, and you saw a couple of very modest liberalizing steps. Biden administration wasn't as focused on sort of, trade policy, very focused on tech policy. So you saw a lot of investment in the strategic partnership between the U.S. and India, and then particularly in tech cooperation. And so the question is really, and India better than I do, so I put it back as a question. I think this could be a moment over the next 1 to 2 years for some real trade deal making. I would like to think that the strategic partnership is developed to a point where India is ready for that step. But India better than I do.
Thanks, Peter. I think with that, we have kind of reached the end of our podcast recording. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Honestly, I would like to pick up this conversation again in a few months down the line and see where we are on these trade issues with the U.S. But thank you for your time, and I think this was very helpful to get a primer on, how might these trade issues evolve going forward between the U.S. and India. So
thank you very much, Konark, for having me on, and would be delighted to come back anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.